Hello and welcome to News Mobile. We have a special guest today, Director General of WIPO, Francis Gurry.
Sorry, thank you.
Mr. Gurry, thank you for talking to News Mobile. It's a privilege to have you with us today.
It's my privilege. Thank you.
You are somebody who has created a new framework, so to say, a global framework for IPR system, and the whole ecosystem now is booming. How do you see it in an era where AI is sweeping, a lot of new technologies coming in? How do you see the whole ecosystem panning out?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that it is a new ecosystem, and that's been driven by the emphasis by policymakers on innovation, its centrality to growth. Intellectual property protects the competitive advantage of innovation. Now I think what we're seeing with this orgy of innovation that we're getting, AI as you mentioned for example, is that some of the old categories are being challenged because they were really invented during the Industrial Revolution. Now we're in a different age, the data, the digital economy. I don't see that the old categories are obsolete, because everything tells us that the demand for them is increasing rather than decreasing. However, perhaps we're going to need some a new layer of rights to deal with some of the questions in and around data.
You come from Melbourne, a very clean city, and I know you're a fitness freak as well. Where do you see your role in ensuring that innovation comes into climate, in stemming the tide of climate change? You're sitting in Delhi. One of the biggest challenges we have is rising AQI, and that's what concerns a lot of citizens now. Yeah. How do you make sure that WIPO takes a predominant role here?
Well, innovation's the answer, because if we don't do things differently, it's going to be the same. So we do need to have innovation. Now, how to stimulate the innovation in the right areas, as you say, and in particular green technologies, environmentally sustainable technologies, it has to enter the market. There have to be some incentives in the market to push the investment of innovation into those areas. So I think eventually the world's got to look at those incentives in terms of pricing, carbon pricing, for example, which will stimulate, I think, further innovation.
One of the pioneering work that WIPO is doing in making sure that piracy is curbed, and this is something I think that's a very, very honorable service that you're doing, because a lot of content creators
Absolutely.
Like us as well, especially the smaller ones, see a ray of hope. Do you see that there is individual countries have to do much more than they're currently doing to make sure the piracy is curbed?
Well, look, I think it's a shared responsibility, actually. Now, what we've seen is that actually digital, after a long period of difficulty with the digital environment, digital sales of content are rising. And they're rising because, I think, in part of the invention of good business models which make content available on accessible terms and reasonable terms to large audiences. So it's taking advantage of this huge potential audience that the internet makes available. So that's a responsibility on the part of the enterprise sector, the accessible business models. But there is also a need for a supporting governmental system to ensure that this is backed by a sanctions regime. Yeah.
How do you see the role of India? India has been a very, very robust partner with WIPO. They've worked together very closely. How do you see the role of India in this whole process?
India is a rising power in innovation and technology. So this is very clear. It's got all of the components in place. The human capital, fantastic human capital. A government that is driving innovation and emphasizing innovation, a very vibrant private sector.
And Prime Minister Modi is really making all-out efforts to
Absolutely,
drive
Prime
innovation.
Minister Modi driving it personally. India's future is clearly in the area of innovation, science, technology, and we will see that more and more and more.
Yeah. You are considered more of a reformer when it comes to WIPO. I do understand you brought in a lot of transformational changes. What is your mantra for success when you get into your office? What are the things that you think a good leader should follow?
Well, I think I tend to put a lot of emphasis on projects at the beginning. I watch very closely at the beginning of a project in the organisation, and then leave more and more latitude to the managers as it goes forward. And then just listen to the results, fortunately, which are usually good. So that's very important, keeping people focused. In any bureaucracy, there's a tendency to spread one's wings. Keeping focused on the results, this is extremely important, and particularly in an area like innovation, intellectual property, which is a horizontal subject. It covers a vast range, every single facet of the economy. So keeping a focus, I think, is extremely important.
I would say you are also a great startup when it comes to the entire UN system. You've created a self-funding model, I believe, and I believe WIPO is one of the only organization which not only creates good fund but also funds some of the other organizations. How does that work?
We have a good model, as you say. 96% of our revenue comes from the services that we render direct to the enterprise sector and research sector. So that's a very fortunate position to be in. And of the total revenue, which is around about let's say $450 million US dollars in a year, 20% is spent on capacity building and development. So it's a good model coming in from the private sector, the latest technology sector, and ensuring that part of that, a fifth, is spent on capacity building.
We were talking yesterday and you were mentioning that you're attracting a lot of global talent now to WIPO, getting a lot of people from the private sector. How does that work? You getting people who are specialists? How does
It's great. We absolutely need them. For example, in the area you mentioned, artificial intelligence, AI, we need AI applications for the administration of the vast volume of intellectual property applications we're receiving. About 250,000 international patent applications every year, 60,000 international trademark applications every year. More and more, some of the tasks can be done by AI that enables us to contain costs, but for that we need the greatest, the best specialists. We're getting a lot of them from India, increasingly in the IT area, ICT area, a lot coming in from India.
I'm glad you mentioned AI because News Mobile is one of the first to start AI news dissemination. So we believe the frontier of the future of technology is very important. I believe one of your personal favorite is yoga.
Yes.
So
Yes.
What is your stress buster at the end of a busy day?
Look, I do it at the start of the day, actually, because if I don't do it at the start of the day, I'm probably too lazy to do it at the end of the day. But it's absolutely indispensable. Yoga is the gift of India to humanity, and I've been doing it for over 30 years now, and it really is, I can't do without it.
What are the next frontiers for WIPO here on? What are the 3 key areas you're going to focus on?
Well, look, I think one is how to move the policy discussion forward in the frontier areas that you mentioned: artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, big data, the gene editing area. Have we got the innovation incentives in the right place through the intellectual property system? So that's one area. Now, it's very difficult for the international community to move these days. It can't agree on the time of day, as a matter of fact. That's the paradox we're living, because we've got more and more of these questions that really require an international discussion, if not international resolution, but the capacity is very hard to find. So trying to crack that nut and starting the conversation about these issues, this is one very important area. Secondly, I think, we are living in a world in which the geography of innovation has changed extraordinarily. We see Asia as the major source and origin of all intellectual property applications now. This is a fantastic change in the course of the last 20 years. But we still have a great technological divide, a great divide in technological capacity around the world. So that must always be a focus for our organisation, is how you can build capacity in those countries that are lacking the capacity for technological development. So that, I think, is a second area. And then thirdly, the digital transformation of the organisation. We are an organisation that derives 96% of its revenue through the services it renders, and those services are rendered on IT platforms. We have to keep the innovation in the delivery systems going.
So that's something which is a focus.
Absolutely.
And what is the biggest challenge for you personally so far? And before I end up, because challenges, overcoming challenges is hallmark of a successful leader.
Well, that's a big question. I'd say, look, a major challenge has been a communication challenge about intellectual property. It's a very abstract subject matter, and we're living in an age in which value has migrated from the physical to the intangible. Now, communicating that across to a broad audience, which increasingly is looking for immediate gratification, and we're about a long-term game. Innovation is a long-term capacity that you have to acquire, and a creative economy is something that requires a long-term effort. This communication challenge is very difficult, but it's a very important one. We have to make it real for people.
Last question before I sign off. A lot of startup founders would be watching you today. What is your message to them? How do you enable them or blend them into the WIPO's ecosystem? What's your message?
I'd say persevere, don't be afraid of failure. That's absolutely an indispensable part of success, particularly for startups, and it will come. Mr.
Gurry, pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Saurabh. Thank you.
Thank you.